Hidden behind thick curtains of secrecy, the CIA once bought nearly the entire global supply of LSD. Not grams, not a few vials, the entire supply. And they didn't stop there. These chemicals were fed into hospitals, prisons, and clinics under the umbrella of research. What could force an intelligence agency to believe this was necessary? The answer lies in MKUltra, a program that blurred science with power, logic with fear. Tonight, we explore how an obsession with mind control reshaped lives, institutions, and history itself in ways that remain chillingly unforgettable. If you enjoy journeys like this, remember to follow Night Atlas for more soothing stories of mystery, myth, and the hidden past. How could fear of something invisible, something as fragile as a human thought, drive a government to secret experiments? At the dawn of the Cold War, America faced an enemy armed not only with weapons, but with ideas. Communism carried its weight not just through force, but through influence, persuasion, and the terrifying possibility of mind control. Leaders in Washington began to speak of something more frightening than nuclear fire. They feared the theft of thought itself, the invasion of private memory, and the reshaping of loyalty. In the quiet spaces between battles, it was the mind that appeared most vulnerable. Reports trickled back from Korea, where prisoners of war returned home telling strange stories. These men, once ordinary soldiers, spoke in broken tones, as if they were not quite the same people who had left. Some praised their captors. Others confessed to actions they swore they never meant to commit. Families, meeting them again, found a strangeness in their eyes that no bullet wound could explain. Rumors spread that Soviet and Chinese doctors had mastered techniques to wash away one identity and put another in its place. The idea of brainwashing took hold, lingering in newspaper pages and quiet briefings, leaving Americans unsettled. You can picture the mood of those years. Air raid sirens tested themselves over city skies. Schools ran drills where children crouched beneath desks, their tiny arms covering their heads as if thin wood could shield them from devastation. But beneath the show of nuclear fear, something quieter whispered, what if another nation could reach inside, past skin and bone, straight into thought? The talk was no longer just about bomb shelters and missiles. The battle might be won or lost in the soft currents of human memory and will. Officials in Washington began to call it the War of the Mind. It was not fought with tanks rumbling across borders, but with whispers, interrogations, and quiet rooms where captives returned changed. The fear had a logic of its own. If soldiers could be broken, if statements could be coaxed or forced under hidden influence, then America was at risk from weapons that left no scars. Political leaders believed that to protect the nation, they needed to discover how far the mind could bend and whether it could break. Imagine soldiers stepping off planes, greeted by their families, their uniforms wrinkled, the strain in their faces unmistakable. Yet behind shaky smiles, something deeper, unsettled loved ones. Husbands who once spoke freely now repeated words as though they had been fed. Voices stumbled over strange confessions. Parents felt a sudden chill as their sons told them things that seemed learned, rehearsed, not born from themselves. This was the soil in which fear grew. To so many Americans, it appeared that adversaries had unlocked control of the brain itself. If it was true, then ignoring it could mean disaster. In the shadows of these concerns, secret projects slowly began. The CIA, still a young agency shaped by wartime habits, carried the task forward. Under names rarely spoken in public, Bluebird and Artichoke, a hidden chapter started. These programs were less about public safety drills and more about whispered experiments behind closed doors. Their goal was both simple and frightening. Could interrogation be carried further, perhaps to erase memory or implant whole new beliefs? Could an unwilling witness be pushed into obedience without even knowing? The code names themselves carried a quiet strangeness, like flowers, masking something poisoned. Project Bluebird, the earliest, spread its wings in the early years, examining hypnosis, drugs, and manipulation. Out of Bluebird emerged Artichoke, a name that hinted at layers peeled back one by one. The layers in this case were not vegetable, but human consciousness. Each layer stripped revealed more questions, more dangerous desires. These projects planted the roots of something that would grow far larger. Behind locked doors, scientists and operatives gathered in rooms with white walls and files stacked high. They carried the belief that if an enemy controlled minds, then America must learn to do it first and better. Out of that belief grew small tests with prisoners, experiments with suggestion, attempts to wipe memory almost like chalk on a slate. None of it carried the light of public knowledge or approval, and few of those involved seemed to ask whether these experiments belonged within the lines of medicine or morality. For them, the mission outweighed the hesitation. Take a slow breath and picture a time when doctors who studied healing found themselves pressed into the service of command. Pills and syringes were no longer meant for comfort or cure. Instead, they became instruments to push a person's mind beyond the limits of trust. These were not open trials with volunteers giving consent. They were careful trials of secrecy, bounded by the belief that national survival might depend on them. People within the agency began to think not of patients, but of subjects, not of cures, but of control. Yet even as Project Artichoke expanded, new questions arose. Was any of this enough? Reports from behind the Iron Curtain still pointed to strange successes in interrogation rooms abroad. The United States feared falling behind in a race that most citizens did not even know existed. Each small discovery, each unsettling success, only sharpened the appetite for more powerful methods. The experiments that started in narrow rooms seemed poised to grow into something larger, a machine of research too wide to stop. These early shadows, fragments of hypnosis, drugs, and suggestions tested on the unknowing, were only the seed bed. What began as Bluebird and grew through Artichoke would soon flower into a program of staggering ambition. MKUltra would not only inherit their aims, but push them into stranger and darker places than any script of normal intelligence work could have justified. What happened next could not be contained by code names as gentle as birds or vegetables. It became something altogether more nightmarish, something that would leave broken lives in its wake. And it all rose from this quiet fear that the true battlefield of the Cold War was not the earth under bombs, but the fragile landscape within every human mind. And so, ambition demanded more than secret rooms and small tests. It demanded new substances, new leaders, and a program broad enough to stretch across universities, prisons, and unsuspecting streets. What lay ahead was larger and far more bleak. Who would be trusted to guide such unusual and risky research? The answer comes in the form of a man who rarely drew public attention, a chemist who did not fit the image of a dangerous figure. His name was Sidney Gottlieb. Within the halls of the CIA, he climbed quickly and quietly, not by loud declarations, but by the steady power of his ideas. He seemed ordinary on the surface, yet behind locked doors, his work reached into realms that few dared to imagine. He was tasked with creating methods to unmake thought, to experiment with the core of human identity. Gottlieb's story carries a curious contradiction. At home, far from sterile laboratories, his life looked almost pastoral. He raised goats. He enjoyed a simple cabin. He spoke softly and often walked with a limp from a childhood disability. To neighbors, he might have seemed like an eccentric intellectual who lived closer to nature than the bustle of the city. Yet each day he returned to rooms where beakers and vials waited, and the air was tense with hidden projects. These were not experiments designed to cure illness. They were arranged as paths into the hidden chambers of the human mind. Picture the contrast. A man tending animals in the quiet of his land, then slipping into sterile basements to administer drugs that stripped memory and twisted perception. This unusual rhythm shaped him into a figure who seemed almost split in two. On one side, there was gentleness and restraint. On the other, a ruthless appetite to test limits without pause. Those who worked around him knew him as a man with calm manners and an almost understated discipline. But behind that calmness was the question of how far a human personality could be altered, and how pain or chemicals could be used to bend a will. The ambition was not small. The CIA needed someone to develop what they sometimes called techniques to crush the psyche. That meant methods to break people down until obedience was unavoidable. Normal approaches of questioning and persuasion were discarded. Gottlieb searched for ways to erase memory as though wiping words from a page, then to write new commands on the blank slate. This hope of making a mind submit belonged not to folklore, but to actual plans carried by government scientists under his guidance. Imagine him in his laboratory, vials lined like tools on a bench. Each mixture carried a promise or a threat. Small crystals, strange liquids, powders with little color. They were blended and prepared with a precision that resembled ritual. To some it was science branching toward the unknown. To others it resembled a sorcerer preparing spells meant to command obedience. In Gottlieb's operations, there was little concern for moral restraint, only the pursuit of absolute control. The studies he arranged were not about healing, but about surrender, not about discovery, but about molding human beings into instruments. One of the most unsettling goals shaped under his guidance was the creation of what the public would later imagine as Manchurian candidates. These were not movie inventions alone. They reflected a real dream, that an unsuspecting individual could be stripped of memory, reshaped in thought, and then directed toward acts they would never have chosen themselves. This ambition carried a haunting prospect that someone could live their days as an ordinary person while carrying hidden instructions deep in their mind, waiting to be activated. Gottlieb pursued this possibility with determination, even as evidence suggested that true success remained beyond reach. Secrecy wrapped around every level of his work. Even inside the CIA, few people fully understood the scope of what he directed. Funds were moved through front organizations, disguising the origins of grants to universities or research centers. Those who carried out experiments often did not realize they were participating in the larger program. Gottlieb preferred layers of distance between headquarters and the field. This way, the work could press forward without drawing unwanted light, and blame could be blurred if details escaped. His willingness to bypass the usual structures of honesty or consent earned him trust among superiors who sought results above ethics. The more he built, the clearer his reputation within the agency became. He was not just another chemist. He became the architect of work that pushed science into territories that bordered on nightmare. Within his grasp lay both innovation and destruction, and he pressed forward with unusual calm. His goal was not the medical cure of suffering, but the careful design of techniques to erase, reshape, and command a human will. Those who later studied his programs would see him as one of the most powerful shapers of MKUltra, guiding its darkest ambitions. When we picture him, this man who cared for goats, this man who lived quietly without the marks of power, it becomes more unnerving to know that by day he pursued absolute mastery over human thought. His plainness only sharpened the weight of his secret life. The line between ordinary existence and secret cruelty folded into one figure. Gottlieb captured that contradiction fully. A calm exterior, a quiet presence, and at the same time, a hand reaching to rewrite what it meant to be human at its very center. The work was not complete with theory alone. To move further, Gottlieb required more than small doses or shifting techniques. He needed powerful new substances, chemicals that could reach into the mind in ways no interrogation or hypnosis ever could. Simple hypnosis and variations of suggestion seemed limited. Only something stronger could carry the possibility of wiping a mind clean and imposing fresh orders. This new need pressed against the agency, calling for worldwide searches, covert purchases, and more secretive handling. And so, as the projects grew in scale and ambition, the CIA, under his guidance, turned outward, hunting for drugs that could change perception entirely. What followed was a worldwide effort to locate, buy, and control a substance that seemed almost made for the agency's aims. Its name carried little weight at the start, but soon it would define a whole chapter of experimentation. The search for it drew Gottlieb's attention far from goat fields and quiet cabins and into laboratories stocked with strange bottles smuggled across oceans. The next stage of this story begins with those shipments glowing faintly in their flasks, waiting to be tested on minds that never agreed to become pathways for a secret war. Picture crates stacked in a dim storage warehouse, their contents marked only by coded labels, inside tiny glass bottles of clear liquid resting on straw padding. These are not ordinary shipments. They had traveled quietly across oceans, carried in sealed cargo, hidden among ordinary deliveries. What they held seemed almost harmless at first glance, drops of a new chemical that glittered faintly under the light. But to the people waiting for them in guarded laboratories, these bottles represented a key to the most intimate battlefield imaginable. This was LSD, and to the CIA, it seemed less like a medicine and more like the door to hidden control. The tale of how LSD reached this point begins in Switzerland, with a chemist who had first noticed its strange ability to bend human perception. A substance made during laboratory work suddenly revealed that tiny doses could distort time, shift color, and strip away the boundaries of one's identity. No other drug behaved quite this way. To doctors, it looked like a chance to learn how the brain worked. To artists later, it would become a symbol of expanded experience. But to the CIA, pressing against shadows of the Cold War, it looked like something else entirely. A substance that might open or close the doors of human thought. In a world where they feared enemies, stealing minds, LSD appeared almost like the perfect tool. The agency's leaders carried a quiet fear. They worried not only about what the drug might do in their hands, but what could happen if the Soviets knew first. In those corridors of strategy, where war was a chess game balanced on secrets, the idea of another power harnessing such a tool filled officials with unease. What if interrogations could be carried so far that loyalty was erased? What if whole armies could be bent, not by weapons, but by drops of liquid swallowed unknowingly? These were not idle speculations. Memos and private discussions carried real concern that America could lose not by missiles, but by chemicals that washed away free will. LSD became, in their minds, not just a drug, but a weapon waiting to be deployed. Here, Sidney Gottlieb pressed the idea forward as the chemist already guiding MKUltra. He recognized in LSD a tool whose potential stretched beyond anything they had yet tested. Normal interrogations required time. Hypnosis showed limits. But LSD seemed to unlock doors instantly, exposing fears, altering memory, breaking fixed thought. If one dose could do this, an entire supply could fuel years of research. Gottlieb did not want a few bottles. He wanted it all. With agency support, he moved to secure as much of the global stock as possible. The effort grew into something nearly unthinkable: a single government agency purchasing the majority of LSD worldwide. Imagine for a moment the weight of that action. In the 1950s, this chemical existed only in small labs, produced in limited runs. Yet, as word spread of its strange powers, the CIA placed itself between suppliers and the world's researchers. They directed large sums of money, millions of dollars by today's standards, towards buying and stockpiling the drug. For a time, they became the largest customer of LSD anywhere in the world. The effect was clear. If someone wanted to study the substance, chances were the material had passed in some way through the CIA's hands. It was as though a shadow hand stretched across oceans, buying not only bottles, but influence over global research. Once collected, the agency needed places to test. Universities quietly received grants, often shielded by foundations, so the true source was hidden. Professors and graduate students were told funding came from scientific groups, not realizing the strings pulled behind the curtain. Clinics received supplies for experiments on patients, some of whom had come seeking relief for ordinary struggles like anxiety or depression. Unbeknown to them, doses would be adjusted, repeated, and observed under notes that traveled back to Langley. In prisons, wardens cooperated by allowing researchers to study inmates, men and women, who had little power to refuse. Even hospitals expected to serve as safe ground became testing fields. The network stretched wide, quietly weaving through society. This spread created strange scenes. A college student consenting to a research study on attention might suddenly feel his surroundings bending, voices twisting, time slowing to a crawl. A patient seeking treatment might wake after long days under drug sleep, only to learn that hours vanished in a haze of visions. Guards in small prison wings observed inmates speaking to walls, trembling in fear, or laughing at nothing, unaware of the power altering their senses. None of these people knew that their experience was designed to feed a government file. They thought they had entered ordinary research. Instead, they had stepped onto a secret battlefield. The drug, though, did not follow neat lines of control. Sometimes it broke subjects, pushing them toward paranoia or despair. Sometimes it produced laughter and visions, scenes so bizarre that scientists struggled to record them. In other cases, it changed nothing at all. The unpredictability made LSD both fascinating and dangerous. For the CIA, it was not a matter of medical clarity. They were less interested in healing than in control. Every reaction, even confusion or terror, became data in their search for methods to command obedience. To them, one less stable mind was simply another page in a growing book of techniques. Take a moment to imagine thousands of lives quietly touched by these secret doses. Some were volunteers who thought they were helping science. Many were not given even that choice. They swallowed the drug mixed into drinks, injected in hospital chambers, or taken during sessions disguised as therapy. Hours later, they would wake unable to explain what had washed through their minds. Dreams, paranoia, or gaps in memory stayed with them long after the study ended. For some, it meant losing trust in doctors or institutions forever. For others, it meant years of confusion about why those hours had been stolen. By the mid-1950s, the scale had grown so large that the CIA itself resembled the most active dealer of LSD in the world. But unlike cultural movements that later saw the drug as spiritual or artistic, the agency's interest rested fully on control. They wanted not visions, but obedience, not insight, but domination of memory. University lecture halls, hospital wards, prison cells, all became quiet theaters where this drama played out. From a distance, no one noticed. Up close, lives shifted permanently. So the United States Intelligence Agency had become, in practice, the greatest supplier and distributor of LSD anywhere, hiding this role behind grants and contracts, not for medicine, not for therapy, but as a weapon. It was as if an entire country's machinery had turned toward the project of bending minds. What remained to know was simple, yet chilling. After gathering such vast supplies, after spreading it into so many corners of society, what did the agency actually do with these substances next? Imagine walking into an apartment that seems ordinary in every way. The curtains are drawn, the furniture is modest. A lamp glows softly in the corner. Nothing about the room tells you that someone is listening, yet behind a mirror on the wall, hidden eyes watch. Nosy neighbors? Not at all. These are the careful eyes of the CIA, sitting silently in a secret space, waiting to see how a stranger's mind might bend under a dose of a drug he never agreed to take. That was the world of Operation Midnight Climax. The name itself sounds unusual, even playful, but what took place inside those apartment rooms was not entertainment. It was part of MKUltra's wide experiment. The CIA rented apartments in San Francisco and New York, setting them up as secret safe houses. Inside, the walls were fitted with hidden devices, one-way mirrors, microphones planted in walls, and tape recorders waiting to capture words that a guest might never have wished to share. What made these settings so disturbing was how ordinary they looked to anyone who walked inside. Guests thought they had stepped into a private invitation, unaware that their every gesture and word were becoming data in an experiment on control. The plan worked in a peculiar way. Men were lured into these spaces by prostitutes who had been brought in to serve as bait. These women, paid by the CIA through layers of cover, welcomed strangers who thought the visit was for intimacy or companionship. Instead, the men became unknowing test subjects. They were handed drinks or cigarettes laced quietly with LSD. Within minutes, Their conversations, their movements, and even their fears shifted under the influence of the drug. While they sat unaware of what stirred inside them, CIA officers leaned close to the glass, scribbling notes, recording what paranoia or odd confessions might spill out. Picture it: a small table, a man sipping from a glass while trying to relax into the evening. Across from him, a woman smiles, distracting him with gentle words. He does not notice the bitter taste of his drink or the way his vision begins to ripple. His voice becomes slower or perhaps louder, hard to tell in the haze of the chemical flowing through his body. Behind the mirror, every change is measured against the question of control. How do people behave under stress? What truths do they speak when reality grows uncertain? This strange theater turned human lives into living experiments without a single admission of consent. The man directing much of this activity was George White, a former narcotics agent who found unusual purpose within MKUltra. It was he who oversaw many of these safe houses, ensuring that the apartments stayed stocked and the operations continued smoothly. For him, this was not tiresome work. To White, the job carried a sense of excitement. He enjoyed the strange power of placing a subject under a drugged haze and then observing human nature unravel. This mindset added a layer of unease, as it suggested the watchers were not simply scientists seeking knowledge, but men who sometimes found pleasure in their subjects' confusion. Behind those mirrored walls, the act of watching became almost a performance. The drugged men did not know they were actors, but every pause, every stumble over words, every laugh that stretched too long became part of the record. Recorders spun quietly, catching notes of conversations that sometimes turned surreal. Researchers pressed their headphones close, leaned toward microphones, waiting to hear if secrets fell from the mouths of strangers like coins dropped into a jar. This voyeuristic style of research bore little resemblance to normal government study. It resembled more a private show staged for hidden observers who were never invited guests into the subject's life. There is something particularly unsettling about the intimacy chosen for these experiments. Instead of dosing subjects in obvious laboratories, the CIA built theater-like illusions of trust. A man thought he was safe in private company, opening up thoughts perhaps no one else had heard. In truth, his words poured into machines. His face was lit under artificial lights hidden behind glass. He was not safe. He was not in control. The laughter or blush he thought belonged to a single companion was instead measured and noted by people who viewed him as nothing more than an anonymous subject in their program. Think about what that means for the notion of choice. The men stepping into those apartments had not agreed to experiments, had not signed papers or given legal approval. They thought they were engaging with another person in private. Yet without warning, their minds were altered, their private emotions captured, their words filed away. There is no clearer sign of a lack of consent. It was not misunderstanding. It was deliberate use of unsuspecting people for purposes they would likely never have approved if asked. As time went on, the rooms hosted scene after scene of this hidden theater. Men drawn in through promises of intimacy, left later with gaps in memory, confusion about what they had said, fear about feelings they could not explain. To them, it may have been just a strange night, but to the CIA, it became another page of data. White and his colleagues looked for patterns in paranoia, in confessions, in how far a mind could be steered when under LSD. Yet the outcome never matched the neat goals of control. Each subject reacted differently. Some rambled, some laughed, some panicked. The unpredictability grew clearer even as the notes filled report after report. This strange project raises questions about whether it was ever research in the true sense of the word. Instead of pursuing knowledge with openness, it hid its hand. Instead of protecting subjects, it stripped them of dignity. Rather than walking the path of study, it walked the path of voyeurism, turning lives into playthings for a secret agenda. If MKUltra already carried shadows, this branch placed them under dim lamps that reflected a darker color. It blurred the line not only between science and cruelty, but between study and entertainment. In this way, Operation Midnight Climax remains one of the most unsettling symbols of MKUltra. It showed just how far the CIA was willing to go to test the limits of control. The methods revealed an agency that treated its citizens not as people to be protected, but as resources to be observed. These safe houses were less laboratories, more stages, where ordinary men unknowingly performed under the influence of hidden directors. Instead of healing or protecting society, the experiments chipped away at trust and respect that people placed in private relationships. And yet, as troubling as these midnight apartments were, another part of MKUltra ventured into even colder territory. Across the border in Montreal, soft beds and quiet hospital rooms became something else entirely. The next stage of the story tells how these places of rest turned into rooms where memory itself was erased and where silence replaced the comfort patients once expected. What if sleep was not meant for rest, but for erasing who you were? This is the unsettling question raised by what happened at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, where a respected psychiatrist named Dr. Ewan Cameron carried out experiments that stretched far beyond the limits of therapy. Patients arrived at the institute believing they would be helped. They carried with them depression, anxiety, or the fragile hope that a trusted doctor might ease their suffering. Instead, many found themselves drawn into something entirely different. What lay before them was not comfort, but a program of testing that reached into the deepest parts of their identity. Dr. Cameron's methods began with a practice he called psychic driving. The idea was simple on the surface. Repeated phrases played over and over might guide a patient toward new patterns of thought. But in practice, the repetition went far beyond normal suggestion. Patients were placed in rooms where recordings looped endlessly, carrying the same words thousands of times, often through speakers fixed near pillows or even attached to the body. Imagine lying awake or half asleep and hearing a voice repeat the same sentence hour after hour, day after day. The intent was to break down resistance so that the words would slip past consciousness and settle somewhere hidden inside. What was meant to heal instead became relentless and disorienting, drowning out the patient's own inner voice. The practice was tied to another approach Cameron named de-patterning. Here, the basic structure of a person's mind was not guided, but stripped away. Patients were given powerful drugs to induce long-lasting sleep, sometimes lasting for weeks. They were kept under sedation with little chance to wake. When they were pulled toward consciousness, extreme doses of electroconvulsive therapy were applied. These shocks came not in limited amounts like traditional treatment, but in heavy and repeated sessions strong enough to wipe memories. The combination of chemically induced sleep, looping voices, and extreme shocks formed a system designed not to treat illness, but to erase the patterns that made up personality. Picture a locked hospital room, white walls and a closed door, the blinds drawn against daylight. A patient lies in bed under the grip of sedatives, tubes feeding nutrients, recordings playing quietly but without pause. Nurses attend, but with clinical detachment, checking pulses, adjusting dials, ensuring the unconscious body remains under control. Weeks might pass. When the patient stirred, shocks were applied, sharp blasts of electricity that erased recall and clouded the ability to form new memories. Slowly, speech, movement, and identity dissolved. What might return months later was not the same person who had entered the room, but someone whose inner foundation had been removed piece by piece. Survivor accounts described the consequences with stark clarity. Some could not remember large parts of their childhoods. Others forgot the names of loved ones or even their own. Daily routines had to be relearned as if they were infants again. Skills once carried with ease vanished. A mother might return home from treatment unable to recognize her children. A student might forget entire years of education. These were not subtle changes. They were deep, permanent scars of an experiment carried out in the name of research, yet far outside the boundaries of informed care. To lose memory is to lose self. For many, that was the reality of Cameron's program. The silence of these sleep rooms carries a weight when we picture them now. Hospital beds meant for healing became places where identity was stripped away. Locked doors held in not only patients, but voices. Endless voices repeating the same words through speakers, carving grooves into the mind like water-cutting stone. There was nothing restful in this sleep. It was not the gentle drift of night. It was chemically enforced, paired with shocks of electricity, filling the hours with a silence broken only by machines and recordings. The effect was not restoration, but dissolution. Cameron stood at the center of this practice, respected in his field and admired for his earlier contributions to psychiatry. Yet, under the funding streams of MKUltra, his work took on a dimension that ignored questions of ethics. His focus shifted from care to experimentation, from healing to the reshaping of minds as though people were clay. The methods were justified under the belief that breaking a person down completely might allow a new, healthier structure to be built. But in practice, what emerged was often confusion, emptiness, and loss. The patients who had once walked in seeking help rarely walked away unchanged. When we think of experiments in secrecy, it is often images of hidden laboratories or foreign spies that come to mind. The shock here lies in the setting. These were not hidden safe houses in distant cities. They were hospital rooms in Canada, carried out by a doctor whose reputation drew patients with trust. Families believed they were leaving loved ones in a place of safety and healing. Instead, the rooms became arenas for programs financed by funds that drew from secret intelligence operations. Few outside those circles knew the hand guiding the research. For the patients, there was no informed choice, no understanding of the risks. There was only surrender to the authority of a doctor they thought they could trust. The effects lasted far beyond the walls of the hospital. Survivors often carried blank spaces in memory for the rest of their lives. Some could not remember their own marriages. Others lost language, reading skills, or the ability to feel secure in daily life. They lived with gaps not just in experience, but in identity. When one's past dissolves, the present becomes uncertain, and the future carries the shadow of fear. It is not only the individuals who suffered, but their families, who bore the burden of caring for those who returned with fractured memories and lost parts of themselves. In homes where laughter once filled the air, silence now took root, echoing the silence of the sleep rooms themselves. Looking back, Cameron's work stands as one of the most devastating extensions of MKUltra beyond the United States. It showed that the reach of such hidden programs could cross borders, shaping not only the lives of citizens, but the reputation of institutions meant for healing. It remained hidden for years, its files protected, its victims largely silent. Only later did fragments of the truth emerge, pieced together through surviving documents and the accounts of those who endured it. The picture that emerges now is of a medical program turned into a tool of destruction, erasing not illness, but the minds of the very people it claimed to help. What began as curiosity about therapy became a program that stripped people of the memories that defined them. In those rooms, the boundaries of care were broken, and the line between medicine and manipulation was crossed. The story of the silence of the sleep rooms shows how far ambition can stretch when fear and authority combine. It reminds us that not all experiments happen in hidden labs. Sometimes they occur in places meant for trust. And even as the echoes of these rooms fade into history, the truth of what happened there carries forward. Beyond these drugged sleeps and shocks, the program searched for other ways to reach the mind. In yet another unsettling chapter, it turned toward the mysteries of suggestion and trance, and to the question of whether hypnosis could forge puppets in plain sight. Could a person be hypnotized into murder without knowing it? That question may sound like the beginning of a novel or a play, but in 1954, it was written plainly inside a CIA memo. The document asked, in cold terms, whether a subject could be instructed under hypnosis to carry out an act of violence, even an assassination, and later have no memory of the act itself. It was not meant as metaphor. It was proposed as a real and practical line of testing. For a government agency already stepping deep into drugs and sleep rooms, hypnosis became another possible road toward control of the human will. Hypnosis was at that time already known in medicine. Doctors had used it for pain, for treating habits, or helping with anxiety. Patients would close their eyes, guided by calm voice and suggestion. To those who trusted it, hypnosis revealed that the brain could respond and shift focus without the subject fully aware of the influence. To the CIA, however, this gentle technique took on a darker shade. If words could guide a patient to forget pain, why not guide them to forget an entire memory? If they could be instructed to stop smoking, could they be instructed to carry out actions far beyond their conscious choice? Here, something intended for healing was reshaped into a tool in service of power. Early experiments began with simple tasks. A hypnotist would instruct a subject under trance to do something small, a gesture, a word, perhaps walking across the room. After waking, the subject often carried out the action without understanding why. This pointed toward the possibility of building what researchers described as memory barriers. These were gaps placed between the conscious mind and the instructions given under hypnosis. The subject might hear an order while under trance, but once awake, the instructions slid beneath their normal awareness. Then, at a trigger, perhaps a spoken phrase or a gesture, the subject reacted as if compelled from within. The idea was that orders could be hidden in the folds of the subconscious, invisible until required. Picture this. A man sits quietly in a room, eyes closed, as a hypnotist speaks in even tones. He is told that when he hears a certain word later, he will stand and open a book on the table. Minutes after regaining awareness, the hypnotist says the signal word. The man rises, looks startled, yet follows the instruction. When asked, he cannot explain why he did it. To the observers, this seemed evidence enough that the mind could carry hidden instructions. Small acts like this raised questions about larger actions. If opening a book could be planted, what about pulling a trigger? This is where the specter of what would later be known as Manchurian candidates appeared. Popular imagination turned the phrase into stories of brainwashed assassins, people who looked ordinary, yet carried hidden commands inside them. But before fiction borrowed the concept, the CIA itself was testing whether such a puppet could exist in real life. Hypnosis, paired with drugs or stress, appeared to offer exactly this. Could someone be trained to carry out violence, then return to daily life with no memory? Memos asked these questions directly. Tests tried to answer them through staged scenarios. Subjects were guided to perform uncomfortable actions, convinced into believing what they were doing was natural, then stripped of memory afterward. Among the figures tied to these experiments was Dr. Louis Jolyon West, often called Jolly West. His name appears in accounts of hypnosis research. West had already explored altered states of mind, fascinated by how suggestion and chemicals could work together. Under programs supported by CIA funding, he examined hypnosis not as stage trick or therapy, but as a field of hidden influence. His work added to the body of research that suggested minds could be reshaped through strain and instruction, that the line between choice and command was thinner than most believed. The testing did not create perfect assassins. Human minds proved less predictable than Memoranda had imagined. Triggers did not always work. Some subjects broke free from trance, others resisted commands, and many responded in inconsistent ways. The fantasy of a flawless hidden agent never matched the messy reality of complex minds. Yet the pursuit continued because even partial obedience mattered. If hypnosis could coax secrets from a prisoner, reduce resistance to questioning, or plant confusion, the agency saw purpose. In that shadowed space between science and secrecy, gaps in memory and hidden commands still looked useful. Imagine again the silence of a test room. A subject, unaware of the true nature of the program, sits across from a hypnotist. Their eyes close. A phrase is repeated softly, until their breathing falls into rhythm. Suggestions are offered, strange instructions that will surface later. Afterward, the subject opens their eyes, smiles faintly, and believes the session is over. Hours later, in a different room, a small trigger phrase awakens the buried order. Perhaps they light a cigarette without knowing they had been told. Perhaps they say a line without realizing it was planted. To the subject, it is chance. To the observers, it is proof that part of the will has been touched. The dream of hypnotic control lay in promises of secrecy. An ordinary person could carry an order without even knowing they had it. Under questioning, they would reveal nothing, because there was nothing they consciously knew. Only the buried suggestion remained, waiting for a trigger. For covert operations, this imagined power was priceless. It meant carrying out tasks without the weight of memory or guilt. The subject would appear innocent to any authority, yet still carry the potential of obedience. This was the fantasy recorded in files and discussed in offices even as real results stayed unreliable. The truth is that no one was ever transformed into a perfect puppet of hypnosis. The experiments did not deliver what their planners imagined. However, what matters is that the search revealed the agency's deeper obsession. At its core, MKUltra was not about drugs alone, not about laboratories alone, but about the dream of erasing free will. Hypnosis carried that dream in clear form. The idea that a person's deepest choices could be stolen, replaced with commands, shows the reach of ambition behind the program. Take a slow moment to notice how all these experiments share the same pattern: secrecy, hidden purpose, and absence of consent. They were not carried out with open agreements or clear warnings. Subjects were often unaware from the start. The people hypnotized did not realize they were being turned into test cases for hidden commands. They thought they were in therapy or training, or sometimes nothing more than giving their time for study. Instead, records show they became part of a broader attempt to build tools of control. And so the scene of hypnosis closes not with assassins walking away, but with ordinary people left in confusion, sometimes harmed, sometimes simply disoriented. What remains is less the creation of perfect killers and more the exposure of an institution's willingness to chase the illusion of absolute command over human minds. This is the legacy of hypnotic programming within MKUltra. Not success, but obsession. And as the program spilled outward, it no longer relied only on volunteers playing small parts in controlled rooms. Many of the people drawn into these experiments were never asked at all, never given the choice to refuse, yet still found their lives reshaped by forces they could not see. Now, close your eyes, relax, and let the story guide you. From here, imagine the scenes in your mind as the story unfolds. What if the small corner room you're lying in at a hospital, or the cell you wake up to each morning in prison, was not meant for care or punishment alone, but for an experiment you never agreed to? Take a quiet moment to picture the strangeness of that idea. You arrive for help, or because the law requires you to stay, and without your knowledge, a second purpose is layered over your life. You're not just a patient. You're not just an inmate. In secret, you're also being observed, recorded, altered, as if your body and mind belonged not to you, but to a hidden scientist's notes. This is how MKUltra slowly spread across ordinary corners of society, far from spy bases and hidden labs, until it brushed against people who never imagined they had stepped into its reach. The expansion happened through soft disguises. Government money flowed outward, but rarely in straight lines. Instead, funds were handed to front groups, organizations that looked independent but were tied quietly to the agency. These fronts gave grants to hospitals, to universities, and even to clinics that served everyday people. On paperwork, it looked like normal research. Doctors accepted support, thinking it came from foundations eager to promote science. Professors put their name on projects, never knowing where the budgets had truly begun. The connections were shaped to disappear, like footpaths traced over and over until the original trail could not be seen. At least 80 institutions, sometimes more, received some touch of this funding. So the reach expanded, hidden in daylight, embedded within respected places of medicine and learning. Now imagine an ordinary student at a university in the late 1950s. They answer a flyer that invites them to join an attention study or a trial meant to measure reaction times. The setting feels safe, fluorescent lights above, clipboards carried by graduate researchers, the hum of machines in a lab. Without explanation, they drink a mixture or receive a pill. At first it feels like nothing, but within an hour the walls seem to shift, thoughts scatter, time stretches and breaks. They do not know it, but what runs through their veins is LSD, or another chemical prepared through MKUltra's chain of funding. They had walked in expecting notes and tests on memory. They leave with hours missing from their lives and strange fears lingering in their minds. The data they provided does not appear in a classroom record. Instead, it is written into reports filed in folders with government seals. In prisons, the pattern grew even darker. Inmates found themselves offered small benefits in exchange for joining programs, reduced labor, better meals, or even the vague idea of earning favor. For those with little to lose, it seemed worth the risk. Instead, they became subjects of daily dosing, sometimes for weeks in a row. The drug was swallowed again and again until the mind felt loosened from control altogether. Days became puzzles of racing thoughts, paranoia, or exhaustion. Guards watched, noting behaviors, sending descriptions back to the researchers. Here, the ethics were not even considered. Prisoners had both their freedom and their consent stripped away, forced into roles they could not escape. When side effects mounted, when fear or collapse came, there was no pause or release. Instead, the program pressed forward, intent on recording every reaction. Ordinary patients in hospitals carried similar burdens. They walked into wards seeking relief for depression, for anxiety, for illnesses of body or mind. Doctors spoke calmly, assuring them that new therapies could offer hope. Needles pressed into arms. Pills were handed as though part of a routine. Unseen to the patients, the doses stemmed not from medical compassion, but from a program chasing control. Some stayed under sedation for days, waking in confusion, without memory of what had happened. Others endured repeated administrations, returning for follow-ups, because their trust in doctors urged them to believe answers were near. Instead, the drugs pulled them further from stability. The treatment rooms meant to be sanctuaries of care instead became extensions of MKUltra's shadow. Think about the weight of daily exposure. For some, heavy doses were given not once, but again and again, stretching weeks at a time. Imagine waking each morning already uncertain of what thoughts are yours and what thoughts are tinted by chemicals slipped into your body. The dizziness, the paranoia, the flickering of memory, it builds over days until you no longer know what is true. This was no accident, but design. Researchers wanted not just one reaction, but to measure the cumulative bends of a person's mind over time. The subjects, many of them unsuspecting and already vulnerable, became living test sites of how long the brain could stretch before it broke. The cost was not only in moments of confusion, but in the shape of entire lives. Some who were dosed carried scars into the rest of their days. Anxiety deepened rather than eased. Sleep turned uneasy. Memories slipped, not through natural aging, but from chemicals forced into veins in the name of secret research. There were cases where stress turned to collapse. There were cases where collapse turned to death. Each of these outcomes was recorded as data, as if numbers on a page could capture the scale of harm. Behind those papers were families left to wonder why their loved one fell into chaos, never knowing the hidden hand that had rewritten the outcome. The silence surrounding these experiments amplified the damage. Because institutions were involved, victims often trusted that their care was legitimate. Students expected universities to protect them. Patients expected doctors to heal them. Prisoners may have expected punishment, but never suspected their suffering would be manipulated for scientific notes. When side effects struck and health deteriorated, questions were met with vague replies. Few understood why the breakdowns occurred. With paperwork disguised, with funding hidden behind layers of fronts, there was nowhere to turn for clear answers. Confusion persisted like a shadow no one could explain. Take a breath and think about how far these shadows spread. University lecture halls filled with students seeking knowledge became testing grounds. Clinic beds meant for hope instead dulled into fields of surveillance. Prison corridors echoed not only with the sound of locked doors, but with the unseen echo of experiments carried out under cover of authority. Each corner of society, from education to health to justice, carried threads pulled quietly by MKUltra's reach. And the people most deeply affected were far from soldiers or spies. They were everyday individuals whose ordinary decisions to study, to heal, to endure became doorways into harm they never consented to. It becomes clear that MKUltra was not contained in secret basements or the narrow rooms of safe houses. It bled into the daily lives of people, unaware that their choices placed them in harm's path. The human cost cannot be measured by data alone. It lingers in stories of memory lost, of mental health shaken, of lives shortened. It lingers in the realization that care, education, and trust were reshaped into tools of manipulation. This spread, quiet yet vast, marks one of the darkest legacies of the program, its ability to reach far beyond spies and secrecy into the private world of ordinary people. And yet, the secrecy did not last forever. One man's sudden and violent death in New York would later pull this hidden story closer to public light. The questions surrounding his fall from a hotel window became the beginning of consequences that the agency had managed to avoid. It was an ending for him, but for the rest of the country, it became the first glimpse into how far control had reached. A window high above a New York street stood open on a cold November night in 1953. From the 13th floor of the Statler Hotel, a man fell to the pavement below. His name was Frank Olson. In the hours that followed, police marked it as a suicide, a tragic end to a troubled mind. It seemed like one more sad story from a city that saw too many of them. But the details of Olson's life and the forces surrounding his death would grow into something larger. Over time, his plunge would come to symbolize the darkest possibilities of a secret program that tried to reach into the human mind itself. Olson was not a casual visitor to New York that night. He was a scientist working with the Army's biological warfare laboratories in Maryland. Much of his research focused on ways to weaken enemies with diseases and toxins. That path had already led him into contact with the CIA, who in those years poured energy and money into exploring weapons that did not always look like weapons. Through these connections, Olson became involved with MKUltra, though he may never have known at the start just how deeply the program would reach into him. 1 week before his fall, Olson attended a retreat with colleagues from both the military and the CIA. At a small lodge in the woods of Maryland, The men exchanged discussions over dinner and drinks. What Olson did not know was that his glass had been mixed quietly with LSD. He had not asked for it, nor been told. The dose had been arranged as part of a test, meant to study reactions in a person unaware they were under its influence. In that room, as laughter continued and conversation drifted, Olson's world began to shift in ways he could not understand. In the days that followed, those close to him noticed a change. Olson, usually steady in demeanor, became anxious and unsettled. He spoke in fragments, doubting himself, questioning his role in the work he carried. He grew uneasy about his position in the program and expressed fears about the direction of the research. His colleagues decided that he needed help. The CIA arranged for him to travel, first to New York City and later possibly to Europe, under the care of agency doctors and officers. The official story was that they wanted to treat him, yet the situation grew heavier as Olson looked less like a patient in need of care and more like a liability in need of control. During his days in New York, Olson was placed in the hands of a CIA-linked doctor and stayed at the Statler Hotel with an agency escort, Robert Lashbrook. What happened across those hours is spoken of mostly in fragments. Olson appeared restless, disturbed, perhaps wrestling with the aftershocks of his LSD experience. His concerns deepened. On the night of November 28th, in the early hours before morning, the window was opened. The official account stated that Olson threw himself through it, fallen to his death on the pavement below. Police reports recorded it as suicide. Lashbrook told investigators that Olson had been unstable, confirming the story of a troubled man. That seemed to close the case. For 2 decades, the matter settled into silence. But in the 1970s, as MKUltra itself began to surface in newspapers and congressional hearings, Olson's name appeared again. His family learned for the first time that Frank had been given LSD without his knowledge. This revelation shifted their understanding of his death. They had been told he was depressed, but now they knew he had been drugged in secret by the very people tasked with working alongside him. They began to ask questions pressing against the official accounts. Why had he been kept in New York under CIA watch? Why was he dosed at all? And why did the agency wait so long to admit the truth? In 1975, President Gerald Ford invited the Olson family to the White House. There, he offered a formal apology for Frank's death and the way it had been handled. The government admitted that the LSD dosing had been unauthorized and harmful. The family received a financial settlement, but the apology did not answer all of their doubts. For them, questions about the final night in the hotel remained. Was it suicide, as records stated? Or had Olson become too much of a risk, too likely to reveal secrets about biological warfare and mind control experiments, leading someone to ensure his silence? In the 1990s, Olson's body was exhumed for a new examination. Forensic experts discovered evidence that cast doubt on the original narrative. Injuries to his head appeared consistent with blunt force trauma that likely occurred before the fall. This suggested that Olson might have been struck, weakening the suicide account. If true, then a darker possibility emerged, that Olson did not leap, but was pushed, or had already been, incapacitated before he ever reached the open window. The findings did not close the story, but instead deepened its shadows. Through these discoveries, Frank Olson's case shifted from a private family tragedy to a public symbol. His fall captured the risks inside programs like MKUltra, where secrecy and hidden experiments blurred the lines between research and abuse. His death showed that the stakes were not confined to anonymous test subjects or nameless prisoners. They touched even the scientists who worked within the circles of power. Olson became an emblem of how a government's pursuit of control over the human mind could turn in on itself, harming not only outsiders, but its own. As years passed, the Olson family continued to speak out. They pressed for fuller disclosure, argued for recognition that Frank had not simply taken his own life, and sought to bring greater clarity to the role of the CIA. Their frustration mirrored a rising discomfort across the United States. As more stories of MKUltra reached daylight, people asked the same questions the Olson family asked. How could such secret experiments be carried out against citizens? How many lives had been broken? How much had been hidden under files burned or lost? The family's pursuit of truth became inseparable from the nation's demand for accountability. Picture again that window in New York, open against the cold night air. 50 years later, it still carried questions that never closed. Olson's body struck the pavement in 1953, but the echoes of his fall stretched far beyond that moment. His death tied together the dangers of secrecy, the blurred line between science and control, and the human cost of programs hidden even from those they entangled. In the silence after, his family carried the truth forward, their struggle reflecting not only private grief, but a country's larger reckoning with what it had allowed its agencies to do. Imagine secrets so heavy that, even locked in drawers and buried beneath layers of denial, they could no longer be contained. They pressed outward until they seeped into the newspapers, the corridors of government, and finally into the ears of a public that had been kept in the dark for too long. By the mid-1970s, with a country already weighed down by Vietnam and Watergate, the silence around hidden experiments began to split and unravel. The secrets of MKUltra were not forced into the light all at once, but leaked slowly, painfully, until they reached Congress itself. The spark came in December of 1974, when journalist Seymour Hersh published a piece that spoke plainly of illegal activities inside the CIA. His words told of agency officers conducting experiments on unwitting citizens, programs that violated not only ethics, but law. Ordinary people turned pages of the New York Times and saw, maybe for the first time, that their government had not just spied, but reached deeply into lives with needles, shocks, and chemicals. The news unsettled many, but for Congress, it marked a line that could no longer be ignored. The whispers about drugs, hypnosis, and control could not stay whispers any longer. Almost at once, Washington responded. President Gerald Ford created what came to be known as the Rockefeller Commission, an effort meant to review and limit some of the agency's darker activities. But digging created more questions than answers. The Rockefeller Commission uncovered fragments of programs that seemed more extensive than first imagined. They saw hints that MKUltra had stretched across institutions and across years, its roots tied not to a small unit, but to broad networks shaped by secret funding. This knowledge was serious, but the Commission's limited power meant that its findings were only the beginning. What it revealed stirred public suspicion and congressional determination for something deeper. By the next year, the stage widened. The United States Senate formed the Church Committee, led by Senator Frank Church of Idaho. This body was not designed to look away. It carried affidavits, called witnesses, and demanded records. Picture senators seated in a chamber, the weight heavy in their faces, listening quietly as testimony revealed experiments that seemed drawn from fiction. Drugs slipped into glasses, patients placed under sedation for weeks. Hypnosis used to mix commands into unguarded minds. These were not rumors now. They were spoken in hearings, carved into the record of the nation. The Church Committee's hearings revealed the true scope of MKUltra. What began as curiosity about brainwashing had spread into 80 institutions, more than 100 sub-projects, and countless lives touched without warning. Witnesses described the logic that had carried these acts forward, the fear of foreign control, the hunger for advantage, the belief that ends could justify means. Senators learned of safe houses where men were lured by prostitutes only to be watched from behind mirrors. They heard of hospital patients kept under sedation for weeks in Canada, children and adults caught in repetitions of phrases meant to rewire their minds. The sheer variety of methods told a story not of careful science, but of obsession. Each senator sat, realizing that their own citizens had been treated not as individuals to protect, but as material to be tested. Among the discoveries lay a hidden oddity. Although much of MKUltra had been destroyed deliberately by CIA officers in 1973, files shredded quickly as attention began to rise. Some papers had escaped destruction. More than 20,000 surviving pages overlooked in a record center because of a filing mistake came suddenly into light. Imagine boxes stacked in a storage room untouched for years, their labels dull and bureaucratic. A worker sorting records found them, and in that accident, decades of secrets found air. These documents did not tell the entire story, but they filled gaps. Lists of sub-projects, financial flows, names of institutions, and descriptions of aims. For investigators, they felt like fragments of a shattered mirror that still reflected enough to see the outlines of what had been done. The discovery shocked Congress. It turned what might have been dismissed as rumor into evidence. No longer did they rely only on testimony, fragile memories, or partial admissions. They held pages that spoke in the agency's own words of funding hypnosis studies, dosing tests, and attempts to design techniques for control. Senators sat with these papers laid out before them, reading a language that described human lives in detached tones, as if people were simply tools. The outrage grew, not because of one or two isolated acts, but because the documents showed. Deliberate planning stretched out across years, across different leaders, carried on quietly, as if unquestioned. Picture the hearing rooms, rows of chairs filled with citizens, journalists, scribbling notes, camera flashes echoing through the halls. At the front, senators asked their questions one by one. Witnesses spoke softly, avoiding eye contact, their answers sometimes careful, sometimes blurred by what they claimed not to remember. Behind the formality lay a stark truth. These programs had existed. They had grown into something massive, and they had used human beings without their consent. In those moments, it became impossible for the nation to pretend it had not happened. In the press and among ordinary people, the revelations struck sharply. Imagine reading in the morning paper that experiments had been conducted inside hospitals resembling your own, or in classrooms belonging to universities not unlike those your children attended. Imagine recognizing that the line between healer, teacher, or officer of the law and secret experimenter had been so thin. Citizens began to question not only what the CIA had done in secret, but what trust could remain between government and people. Each new detail, each patient story created not just anger, but deep disquiet. By the time the church committee presented its findings, the truth stood plainly. The CIA had carried out programs that included slipping drugs to unwitting people, hypnotizing subjects for covert purposes, destroying records to cover tracks, and ignoring the most basic safeguards of ethics. America could no longer claim ignorance. The nation's legislators, its newspapers, and its citizens had seen enough to know that MKUltra had stained the country's conscience. What had been hidden was now public knowledge. The government had experimented on its own people in the chase for control of the human will. Yet for all the light thrown on MKUltra, justice was limited. Many files were gone forever. Many of the people who had endured the experiments could not even remember clearly what had been done to them, their memories fractured by the very drugs they had been given. Compensation was rare, lawsuits dragged on, and apologies, when they came, felt small against the scale of harm. The secret had burst, but the silence that followed felt heavy still, filled with gaps that could never be fully closed. And so the hearings ended not with final answers, but with lingering shadows. The nation had awoken to what was possible when powerful institutions acted without restraint. But even in the midst of disclosure, those who suffered most were left with little. Beyond the official findings, the deeper pain remained scattered in the memories, or the missing memories, of survivors. What came next was less a pursuit of justice than an endurance of consequence, a long shadow carried by those who had lost trust in the very people meant to protect them. What happens to a person when their memories are taken away, but the pain of what they lived through never leaves? Think about that for a moment. The idea that you might forget entire years of your life, yet feel the scars of something you cannot explain. That paradox became the reality for many of those who passed through the hidden corners of MKUltra. Their stories did not end with the closing of experiments or with the hearings in Washington. Their lives stretched onward, and in that stretch lay wide blanks, spaces where days and years had been removed from the chain of memory, leaving behind confusion and quiet suffering. Survivors came forward describing these gaps as if pages had been torn neatly from a book. Some could not recall voices they once loved dearly. Some forgot their own names in moments of disorientation or could not recognize the faces of family. Picture a parent who wakes but does not know her children, not from natural illness of the mind, but from treatments given without choice. Picture a young adult, once eager to study, finding whole classrooms missing from memory, the knowledge learned through hours of work dissolved. Memory makes us who we are. When it is fractured, identity feels reduced to fragments without anchor. One account that stands out is the story of Linda MacDonald. She entered a hospital in Montreal seeking ordinary care, anxious but expecting treatment that might help her. Instead, she was placed into a program of deep drug sleep, sedation lasting for weeks. When she woke, she was no longer herself in the way she had been before. Her memory of childhood, education, and family was gone, as though someone had erased chalk from a board. She had to relearn the simplest things. She had to walk again, to read again, to rebuild skills that most adults carry for life. Imagine the exhaustion of remaking yourself from the ground up, not by natural injury or illness, but because a doctor chose to unwrite your identity. These kinds of experiences left more than lost memory. They carried emotional weight that pressed forward into the rest of life. Survivors spoke of fear that had no name because the events that caused it had been burned away by chemicals or shocks. They described a kind of emptiness, like walking through a familiar room that suddenly has no furniture. Things were supposed to be there, but they could not be recalled. That emptiness did not heal easily. It lingered, affecting relationships, work, and the most private parts of life. For some, it was a silence that never ended as they tried to connect with loved ones through a haze of loss. We can imagine the disorientation. It is like a story missing its beginning and middle, only an ending you do not recognize. Friends speak of old adventures, laughter in years past, but you cannot place even one detail. A sibling mentions a shared childhood memory, but the moment is foreign to you. Such a state creates distance that no words can bridge. Those who endured MKUltra often lived with these distances every day. That is the shape of trauma when memory itself has been stripped away. Governments responded in ways that, on the surface, tried to bring closure. There were official letters, statements of regret, even apologies delivered in the highest offices. In some cases, small financial settlements were offered. Families sat across desks as officials admitted parts of what had happened. Yet the gestures never seemed large enough against the weight of what had been taken. For a person who lost decades of memory, no sum of money could restore what was gone. For a child who grew up with a mother unable to recognize her, an official apology could not create back the bond of those missing years. The gap between the symbolic words and the real cost remained wide. This contrast deepened the wound. To hear leaders admit what had happened showed that victims had not imagined their pain. Yet to see the system answer with limited gestures made the betrayal even sharper. Survivors felt not only the loss of their memories, but the loss of trust in the very institutions that had promised to care for them. Doctors who had been symbols of safety became symbols of harm. Hospitals and clinics, places where healing was expected, turned out to be silent stages for experiments ordered by forces far away. The shattering of trust became as harmful as the loss of memory itself. It is one thing to fear illness and another to fear betrayal by those meant to protect. Survivors carried that sense forward. Linda MacDonald once described realizing that her own mind had been stripped not by the movements of nature, but by the calculated actions of those she should have been able to trust most. Others echoed this feeling, quiet but heavy, the knowledge that care had been replaced by control and science had been turned into weaponry. These reflections reveal how harm is measured not only in what was done, but in who did it. The wound went beyond the body. It reached into the bond between patient and healer, citizen and state. The deepest point of pain for many survivors was not only the moments of drugs, shocks, or hypnosis, but the fact that they were never asked. No piece of paper bore their signature. No words of warning were ever given. Consent simply did not exist. The absence of that choice left them not only harmed, but silenced. If experiments had been explained and consent given, survivors would at least know the reason and the risks. Instead, they awoke to a broken state of self with no explanation. The violation of choice, the denial of even the chance to refuse, marked the core wound of MKUltra. Close your eyes for a second and think about how strong the idea of choice is in your daily life. From small things like what food to eat, to larger choices like who to share your trust with, decisions help form who we are. To have that taken away at the most personal level means losing not only the self you had, but the self you might have chosen to become. This truth explains why the harm of MKUltra lives on, even when decades have passed. It is not simply about what was lost in memory, but about knowing that identity itself was used like clay, reshaped in silence without permission. When their accounts reached the public, they became reminders of more than secrecy. They showed the fragile border between care and abuse. They asked what happens when power is allowed to wander without clear boundaries. They spoke of silence pressed into history, but also of warnings for the present. To look at these survivors is to see the long shadows left not only by drugs or shocks, but by human decisions and human authority. And as we listen, it becomes clear that MKUltra is not only a chapter of Cold War paranoia. It is a deep lesson about what happens when fear, ambition, and secrecy cross the boundary into human dignity. Beyond every dose, every recording, every hypnotic command, the lesson lies in the necessity of restraint. Because without it, even the most private frontier, the mind itself, can be used as a battlefield. Take a moment to imagine how silence and secrecy can shape the course of lives. MKUltra reminds us that science, when hidden in shadow, can be turned from healing into harm. Fear drove those choices, but the damage reached ordinary people who never stood in war rooms or held power. This is not just a Cold War story. It is a reminder that unchecked authority can take any tool and transform it into a weapon. Protecting the mind itself may be the last safeguard of dignity, a frontier that belongs not to governments, but to every human being.